Good morning, everybody. I hope that you can all hear me. I'm sure you can. We're going to get started. I know that there will be people that jump in as we're going on, but I want to be respectful of your time. I know that it's a really, a really busy day with a lot going on. So anyway, without any further ado, we're going to start this session. I'm going to leave introductions until later on. And we're just going to get going on this. We, have been hearing from all of you that, of course, you're in the middle of planning for next year, which is always challenging, but it's much more challenging when there's so much uncertainty. So hopefully this will help give you an approach, at least, that will help you have these important discussions at your schools. So if you have questions, you can throw them in the chat box, and Andrea and I will watch them. After I'm just going to spend a little time just setting the table for our discussion. Some of you may have seen some of these slides yesterday with the heads of school presentation with CAIS, but this is just going to kind of set the tone for what our environment is right now in California. So using our handy dandy survey, we took a look at what was going on with schools. And basically what this tells us is what has already gone on. It does not predict what is going to happen, but we're going to make a few little assumptions based on this. So as you can see, the total enrollment change year over year for both boarding schools and day school enrollment it's varied. I mean, basically the median is 0, but there are some schools that had a dip in enrollment, and there are some schools that picked up some kids, and those tails are pretty steep. So there's a difference. It's a school by school thing, and obviously boarding schools have a much different situation than day schools. So we're going to be talking mostly, when I look at numbers, about day schools. Anyway, so there's some differences also by grade. As you can see, and this again confirms what you've all told me over the last several months, that some of those lower grades where the kids really don't benefit so much from an online program got hit hardest. And again, there you can see that there's a difference, but pre-K confirms what we heard anecdotally. So if we look at then some of these other grades, you can see the curve is a little flatter. And so there's less of a difference, but there's still a distinct difference. The median is still around no change. And that confirms what we heard about you might have lost some students and picked up some others. So none of these numbers are particularly surprising. And then I took a quick look at the admissions data, and that also, so yeah, we received year over year. Most, again, the median was the applications received didn't change, but the tails, tell a different story. And so each school is different, and we're gonna, and then the yield ratio. So you got a lot of applications maybe in the summer, and the yield the change was not as great as maybe the overall applications might have led you to believe your yield numbers dropped a little bit. But again, we had families probably inquiring that 6 months earlier had never thought that they were going to look at an independent school. So anyway, so I don't think any of that is super surprising. And then from there, let's look at financial aid. And again, this really reflects this is the financial aid supporting the students that are enrolled now. And again, it shows the increase in financial aid. provided that increase, I can tell you, is greater than the increase of the tuition year over year. So it definitely reflects an increase in financial aid dollars, and when you're looking at net revenue and all of that, and the number of students supported and the awards per student all increased. Not surprising under the circumstances. We know that you all worked very hard to support families in staying in school during this uncertain time. Okay, and again, so net tuition numbers. This is an amazingly flat curve. You can see that there's not a lot of difference from school to school at the percentage of your revenue that you rely upon net tuition revenue for. And I just also took a look at annual fund and auxiliary services to tell you that nothing, this is something you already know, nothing comes close to tuition in what as far as being, you relying on that for your revenue. So that is why, it's a very long way of saying, that's why we're going to be focusing on net tuition today, because that's going to determine everything else for the coming year. And of course, this just shows us this is also an incredibly flat curve, and there's not a lot of difference from school to school on this. This is our biggest and most important expense. So that's a quick run through to set up as we head into our discussion today. And now I'm going to say, if anybody has any questions about that, they can either unmute themselves or throw it in the chat. And in the meantime, I'm going to turn this over to Kelsey, and she's going to go ahead and introduce herself and talk about the agenda. And take it away, Kelsey.
Perfect. Thanks, Martha. My name is Kelsey Roman. I work for a company called Mission and Data. What it does is it creates mission-driven, data-informed products and services for independent schools to help with governance and also with leadership. I am joined today by my former colleague as well as fellow trustee, Alyssa Evans. Do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. My name is Alyssa Evans, and this is the first time we've presented together. And I work for Mission Enrollment, so we both have a strong mission. We came from NAIS, so we're all about the mission, right? So I work directly with about 40 schools across this country, and schools outsource the financial aid processing to my organization. We processed last year about 6,000 applications for financial aid. So I have been diving deeply into COVID impacted files and such. And so we work with schools coming for the next season, either just in their regular financial aid needs, or even just separated out by reviewing those really difficult COVID impacted folders.
Mm-hmm. And it's really exciting for me to be able to present with Alyssa because, like we said, we are both trustees of a school in California, the Hollywood Schoolhouse down in West Hollywood, California. So we are looking at budgeting process from both our professional sides, but also as a trustee. So we're really going to hopefully tell you both sides so you can improve your budgeting process. So the genesis of this webinar was a conversation that I was having with Martha a couple of weeks or maybe even a month ago about how to help schools better model their finances and have a more smooth budgeting process going through this very strange fiscal 21-22 year. And it really boiled down to, how do we help schools have better assumptions? Because better assumptions will create better models. And as Martha was saying, it really all boils down to the concept of net tuition revenue. Because as you saw in that graph, and you'll see in my next slide as well, net tuition revenue is the lion's share of everyone's revenues coming in. So what we're going to do is we're going to be really cognizant of the place that you're finding yourselves in. I was talking to a CFO client of mine yesterday who said she has never been so overworked, overstressed, undersleeping, and then also burnt out. So when we are going through this webinar today, we are going to show you different ways to build better assumptions, to build iterative budget scenarios, and then to also use that with your board. But we're cognizant of the amount of time and bandwidth that you have. So we're going to give you the easiest and simplest ways to do it if that's all the bandwidth you have. And then we're going to show you ways to add complexity if you have that time, if you have that effort. So as we're going through this webinar, we're going to first start with how to build better assumptions using a data-driven approach. And then we're going to show you how do you take those assumptions and then build iterative budget scenarios. And then, since both Alyssa and I are that trustee piece, is how do you bring and communicate those budgets to your board in a way that makes our stress level, makes our fear decrease. So you're engaging the board in a really proactive scenario planning exercise and a prioritization that's really mission driven and mission aligned. All right. And then feel free to add comments in the chat as we go through the presentation. All right, so again, you saw this graph with Martha. I'm just presenting it in a little bit different of a way. So I'm showing you both gross and net tuition revenue. So there's that question in the chat of whether things were gross or net. You're seeing it both here now, both gross tuition as a percentage of operating revenue, as well as net tuition and fees as a percentage of operating revenue, and then that financial aid as a percentage of gross tuition and fees. So the question that I have for all of you, if you can add in the chat, is where are you landing in this graph? Are you more towards the upper limits of this, the 75% mark, or the 25% mark? So just as much as you know your own school, what is the percentage of, let's say, net tuition and fees of your operating revenue? So again, what is the percentage that net tuition and fees takes up of your operating revenue, just so that we can set the scene. So while you're going ahead and adding those numbers into the chat, and you can be general, I really focus on data visualization and helping CFOs explain and tell a data story to their board. And so one of the best pieces of advice that I can give you is start out your conversations with a graph like this. I've seen so many conversations at the board level being derailed and spending 20 minutes talking about summer camp when summer camp might be 1% or 2% of your overall operating revenue. So showing the board and really situating and giving context to this discussion of here's where we should be spending 93%, 88%, even 60% of our time on, because that represents those percentages of our revenue. So I'm seeing the vast majority of you, net tuition revenue is, again, the lion's share. So in this year right now, 55%, that's an outlier for sure. So in this year, if you might not have as much time, effort, bandwidth to take on major budget changes and modifications, what we're suggesting to you is really focusing on net tuition revenue. And one of the big pieces is that it's really difficult to forecast enrollment based on historicals this year. A lot of people have always used historical trends, historical averages to forecast enrollment. What I'm telling you, unfortunately, is that is going to be really difficult because we don't know what effect all of the externalities will have on our enrollment. And what we want to do is we want to give you an opportunity to leave behind the historical approach of forecasting enrollment and try something different. And so what I'm suggesting to you is, and I know this is asking your enrollment management colleague to do more work, but this is worth that time and effort. So the idea would be to do an enrollment funnel audit and assign probability percentages to both the returning and the new students who are coming through your funnel. So you're going to be asking your enrollment team, all right, what if we have our entire returning group of students, what percentage of those, or how many of those students can we say we are almost 100%? Notice I have 99% for committed, because you can never be 100% sure that they're coming back. But how many of those students are we 99% sure that they are coming back? We can call those committed. Likewise, what is the number of students in our returning funnel that are highly probable for returning, and probable and possible and unlikely? And then how many of those students do we know are going to be leaving the school through attrition. And we would do that same process of classifying our new students in the enrollment funnel. How many of those are committed, highly probable, possible, and unlikely. And so what you're doing with this situation, this classification, is you're setting up a sensitivity analysis. Okay. So I'm going to show you what this would look like. And this is an exercise that I do with the schools that I'm working with. So on the left side of your sensitivity analysis, you would have your enrollment. So what I've done is I've run the sensitivity analysis by division. And then I've used the ranges of the probabilities to create the variation within the sensitivity. And then I've also used the tuition that we're assuming we're going to be charging in that division. And then I've allowed a sensitivity analysis, a range of either 1% to 2%. So all of this is flexible as you're building your budget. So as you create an individual sensitivity analysis for each one of those divisions, then it can be rolled up. And you see that the overall tuition, the overall enrollment, of the lower school, middle school, and upper school can be added and displayed on the left-hand side of your sensitivity analysis. And then the factors in the middle would be the gross tuition that you could be assuming you would be getting. So with the sensitivity analysis based on this probabilistic enrollment forecast, what you're doing is you're creating a range of possibilities. Of here is the universe of possibilities of gross tuition that we could possibly get based on where our enrollment colleagues think we are in terms of being assured that students are coming back. So we're going to build on this because this builds only the gross tuition, the gross revenue. And I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa so she can talk to us about how we can do a data-informed way of building financial aid projections.
Thanks, Kelsey. So this year I've been thinking about the transition of, time and effort. So it was great that we want to acknowledge that if your only job were to do one piece of the puzzle and you also didn't have maybe parking lot duty or, setting up plexiglass everywhere, this would be an amazing exercise to do in a real detailed way. Perhaps, I keep saying with all my schools, perhaps next summer. This will be a project perhaps next summer. But for right now, you have to do projecting for financial aid. You have to get your data pulled together to bring to your board. The big part of this is the timelines have even shifted. So I didn't even add this in here, but one of the things I'm sure all of you are seeing, and I'm really seeing this deeply, is that in order to start building out the sensitivity stuff, knowing when you're reaching out to the admissions and enrollment folks, potentially letting them know you're aware of the fact that families are delaying. They're delaying applying for admission. They're delaying. I'm in near constant battle for people applying for financial aid, getting those applications in. Everybody is on I want to say, a clearly 2-week shift in doing any of these things. So when you present this concept to your admissions folks, just kind of being aware of the fact that they are likely on even a slightly further delay than they would have been this time last year. And so also getting those, where were we this time last year versus this time this year? Those just give yourself the asterisk to know that that might be off a little bit. And I'm seeing that sort of universally across the board with my schools. But with the delay in families starting the applications or getting those rocking and rolling, one of the things I've been really trying to push this year with schools that maybe even haven't opened their application process, or they've just opened it up and nobody has got the financial aid documents in, or they haven't made the requirements yet. With the timelines being pushed and with sensitivity around, we're not sure if families are going to be coming back. If you're a school that does not do your awarding for financial aid with your re-enrollment contracts, I would implore you to reconsider that. And I know that puts a lot more on your processors that do financial aid, but it really, families this year, I think, are going to be challenged with signing enrollment contracts without knowing what kind of financial aid they're going to be getting. And the sooner you know that it goes from 60% chance they're coming back to a 99% chance, all of this other projecting kind of falls in a better line. So if you do nothing else but trying to ask families to complete their applications sooner and or consider using prior year tax documents in your processing that would give you the data a little bit sooner. And again, that could be a whole presentation, but for this year in particular, since we're talking about sensitivity and percentage of we think people are coming back, I think one way to bump that up would really be to have your re-enrollments, if you don't already include a projected financial aid award, to really consider that for this year upcoming. Okay, so researching internal and external drivers for impacting financial aid families. There's lots of places we can look to find drivers, and a lot of it we actually already own this data. And then we're going to talk about creating a COVID archetype and assigning potential impacts. So I spend most of my time talking to admissions professionals, and archetypes is very much an admissions sort of branding type of thing. Like, this is Susie, mother of two, lives in the Valley. This is, Johnny, whatever. You're different types of families, but I would say we could create COVID archetypes that are more specific to our families. The large industry group that is located, you have a large percentage of your families from this particular business, that can be its own archetype, and see what the impact of that group was last year. And then you create almost your impacted archetypes. And then delivering financial aid projections to your finance committee. And we'll talk about that at the end. But I'll just show you kind of a sample. And I do actually have a sample spreadsheet that I use with my schools when they're projecting aid for the year ahead, and how I've added some additional columns for COVID stuff. So you guys all know where you can find your resources, but I think one area that is deeply missing from all of this is there is a treasure trove of data that lives in the financial aid applications that your families fill out. Certainly for the world that we're in right now for COVID, we got a lot of detailed information, but even when it's not COVID land, we ask families everything under the sun. You've got historical data over time in these applications, and in every financial aid system, I use all of them, the data exports right to Excel. By academic year, and then some of it is junk in versus junk out. So if you use your financial aid assessment tool simply as a place to have numbers render, but you don't go back in and close out the folders or things like that, probably not as useful. But there is tons of data in there that you could gather from last year specifically to talk about, in those archetypes, what families reached out for additional financial aid that were already financial aid families. Are there trends there? What families were part of your population that for the first time, they were your returning new to aid that had never applied for financial aid, but were COVID impacted specifically? I had put together just a supplemental questionnaire for several of my schools, and I probably gave that out about 200 times to other schools, because there were questions we needed from our COVID impacted families that were full pay that no financial aid assessment tool would ever have made them eligible for any meaningful amount of financial aid, if anything at all. So we needed to ask different questions that were very specific to this time frame. And there, a lot of folks did a Google sheet or a Google form. That data, it all exports to Excel. So mining that data, because those are your people you're most concerned about, is that you really can't afford to have a very high percentage of your returning full pay families now all of a sudden either falling into your normal financial aid portfolio, or just simply reaching out for temporary assistance. That's going to be something we have to pay very close attention to in this next year, depending on geographically where you're located. I think the two coasts have been most impacted as far as the schools I'm working on. And so depending on the industry in that area, we've seen a higher instance of full pay families really being deeply impacted. And then the billing data. So this is something I've started to do in most of the financial aid systems. You can sort of create these additional tags where you can tag a family for different things beyond just financial aid. So I tagged all the folders that someone had said they were impacted by COVID, knowing that unfortunately this probably wasn't going to be a half year or a 1 year situation. And so running the data after the fact, I was never going to remember who was COVID impacted or not. By simply tagging the families as COVID impacted as an additional filter, you're able to kind of pull, isolate that group. But the slow pay families was a really kind of a lagging situation where we would offer financial aid under pre-COVID situations, and there were still families that were slow pay that were on financial aid. And I would have recommended in just normal years, we need to look at that and find out, are we under awarding them? Is there something we're not accounting for? But in this year in particular, those slow pay families, which you are sort of the keeper of the keys of knowing who those slow pay families are, getting that data into your financial aid assessment might help to decide, are we going to give a little bit more this year potentially because they were already on a downward trend, or the risk of them just completely becoming over, if they're already late from this current year, what is next year going to look like? So just an additional data point that you can simply use an optional field to say slow pay equals yes. And then externally, there's all sorts of, I mean, you guys know, you're business officers, there's all sorts of data out there on what is happening both nationally, regionally, locally. I have been thoroughly enjoying the very boring SBA calls I go on every couple of weeks. And I go into the local, like Orange County and LA County, they have these joint presentations on, you know, what is happening with the economic disaster loan, the EIDL loan, what's happening with PPP, how are folks, this is going to be so important this month, how are folks going to submit for it to become a grant? Now, all of our schools, we're in good shape. Anyone that got a PPP this year, it's not going to take much to prove that it was used for what it was intended for, and it will turn into a grant. And it won't be something that you owe. But small business owners are very concerned that their PPP will turn into a loan, and it's not a, it's could be a very high monthly payment. So I'm paying deep attention to that to see, you know, when are folks going to start getting notified that either they've qualified for it to be a grant or not, right? So that's really important. And then your association data, Cal-ISBOA has all sorts of really deep information. And oftentimes we feel like we're isolated in our own little silo, and it feels good, if nothing like misery needs company. We all need to know that we're in this, you know, situation pretty similarly. And if you're not in either direction, finding out what's unique and what's working for you or not working. So internal research, like I said, I'm just showing you a quick, this is a screenshot of in SSS, but really any of the systems have this, that, you know, running reports on things like occupations, then large organizations. So the school my kids go to, we have about 35% of the population that go there, full pay, kind of all in. It's a K 18 months to 6th grade. 35% of the population comes from one organization, which is absolutely terrifying, because if that organization were to leave, it's Esri. Actually, you guys probably know Esri. Esri is a large global mapping software that you all should be using for your mapping out where your people are. So if they were to leave, we are in serious trouble because we don't have a big population of other big organizations. And so really paying attention to what's happening at that organization. Are they still in good shape? Small business owners and gig workers, that was a big group that was deeply impacted by COVID, because there was a long period of time they weren't eligible for unemployment. They weren't making money. So just think of your Uber driver, right? And now they're able to get some benefits and stuff. So just paying attention to who those people are in your population, in your financial aid population. And unemployed, those that have been unemployed since they applied last year, and either they reached back out to you and said, hey, yeah, we lost our job in March, thought it was going to be a little furlough. I am still unemployed. So really looking into those applications. So all of this information is really a matter of one or two quick reports out of your financial aid assessment tool. And I just plucked this off. I was trying to find some more current data on California. You know, who are they, just to give you, you know, I know in my mind when I'm looking at schools, if I'm looking at a school, you know, like the Hollywood Schoolhouse, for example, where we're on the board, we know that we have a high percentage of families that are in the entertainment industry, right? So I knew when I was seeing families applying for financial aid, if they worked for Warner Brothers, they worked for Universal Studios, Netflix, what have you, they were going to probably be deeply impacted. So I really paid attention to what the industry was saying, and they were supposed to all go back to work in September, and that did not happen. But I was paying attention to what's happening industry-wide. So if you're in tech, if tech is your big industry, if tourism is your big industry, but obviously in California, we have a lot of the creative arts, and you can see how deeply impacted by different subset has been impacted, just doing some quick Google searching. So again, looking at the SBAs, I get an email from the SBA every week that just gives me updates on what's happening with small businesses. I mean, that might be a little excessive, but just kind of checking in on their website and what's happening. And then just, you know, checking in the New York Times or what have you, what's happening locally in your area to see if there's any new external factors. So, and I'm going to give you a sample. Anyone that's ever come to a presentation that I've ever delivered, I'm all about no reason to recreate any wheels here. I create documents and samples and whatever. So if, as you're kind of thinking this through, if you're like, hey, do you have a sample, whatever, let me know. I probably have something, but I do have a sample spreadsheet I'll share with you on how I do my projecting aid for my school. So we do this every year anyway, just setting the season up saying, we're going to push forward, graduate all of our graduating seniors or sixth graders that were on financial aid. That money sort of immediately is available in some ways for our new families, and then progressing our kids forward. And then I would always just do a generic, let's keep them on the same percentage of need. Tuition, let's make an assumption of what we've done. Maybe it's a 3% increase in tuition. What would be the estimated new financial aid award, assuming nothing has changed in their life, plus or minus? And just do that sort of generically across the board. And that would give me a good estimate on how much I think was going to be reserved for my returning families. And that really helps your enrollment folks and your admissions folks, because if there's really nothing left, and that's what we're going to find this year, if we have so much of it tied up, or what our normal budget is tied up in returning families that we assume are returning, we are going to lose the ability to attract new families that need financial aid, really at any varying level. So if you have enough financial aid to give out, 3 50% awards, and you typically give out 8, your admissions folks are really in trouble, because they can't find, as much as we'd love for them to find more full pay families, it is going to be a challenge for them to find them. And then it's going to just kind of adding, you're really limiting their capacity to grow. What I did this year, or what I'm making the recommendation for, is, like if you have this would be generous. You have a $6 million financial aid budget, and you could just, tag or put a line item for, $300,000 is going to be COVID financial aid that we're either going to set aside, or if you've done fundraising last year and you're doing it again, keeping it aside. I want to say my schools averaged budgets for just COVID specific issues or families that needed aid for COVID. They averaged between, and the lower end, maybe $150,000, and the higher end being about $350,000. And I don't think anybody blew those budgets out of the water. In fact, I know they didn't, at least with my schools, but that was because this happened in March, right? Was when all this started. I think we are going to just see higher financial aid family, in regular sort of traditional financial aid. Those one-timers are now going to just start filtering into our regular financial aid process. So doing the complexity is going to be really, again, I assume you probably don't have a ton of time for this, but even if you simply break out those that are part of one organization and say, let's bump it up, I think you'll be in good shape.
Great. So Alyssa told us how to project out financial aid. We can do a sensitivity analysis to do gross tuition revenue. So put those together, we've got our net tuition revenue, which is, again, the lion's share of your operating revenue. If you are one of those schools where you are really counting on fundraising to cover that gap, then you can also do a probabilistic projection for fundraising as well. Same thing, bring your advancement or your development director in and have that person really look at their at the amount of monies that they're projecting to get, and categorize it in that committed, highly probable, possible, and unlikely as well. And so what you're seeing down there at the range, you're going to notice we're going to take these numbers and very similar in the tuition and enrollment sensitivity analysis, we can use those numbers, those ranges, to build a budget scenario. So before we talk about building the budget scenario, we all know that a budget is only as good as its assumptions. And I am from Louisiana, and I was actually part of this hurricane when I was visiting my mom. So, we know when we're projecting out hurricanes, we see the smaller little range of possibilities when it's closer in. And then as we project out further and further, that range of possibilities is less accurate. So Alyssa, what I wanted to ask you is, when you're projecting out financial aid, what is the frequency of updating that you recommend? Because your assumptions today are going to be vastly different than your assumptions, let's say, in March. So instead of reinventing the wheel over and over again, how can you have a better and more uniform process of updating?
Well, I think the first key timeline is you want to do the first one before or as close to when the finance committee of your board is meeting to set the budgets, and doing that first assessment to either let them know that you need more financially than they were projecting, or they were just going to allocate, or you're kind of right on track. So I would do a first one right around now. I think now is the time to do the first one, and then I would run a second one after your first round, your re-enrollment, which would for most schools is around February. And then I would do one sort of final one around March, April. And then it would just really depend if you are going to open up a very specific COVID process that would not take place until the spring, kind of mirroring last year, then you would might do one more at the end of, June or something. But I think you're sufficient doing one now, one by, mid-February, early March.
Mhm. All right, so we're going to take those better budget assumptions that we built using our sensitivity analysis for gross tuition, our financial aid projections, and if you would want as well, your fundraising projections. And then we're going to use those to build budget scenarios. One of the things that I saw a lot of times, both working with schools and as well as being on the board of a school, was that it seemed like every single month there was a new budget. And it just seemed like so much wasted time and effort to have to rebuild everything. And so what I would really suggest everybody do is create as flexible and as iterative a process in the beginning, and doing that by using budget scenarios. And so again, we're really trying to be cognizant of how much you already have on your plate. You're probably running testing, COVID testing. You might or might not have even gotten your audit finished yet. So the simplest and easiest way to build different cases, a base case, an upside case, and a downside case for budget scenarios, is only to vary the net tuition revenue. Because if really 67, 70, 80, 90% of your operating revenue comes from net tuition revenue, just by varying that one factor, you're going to have wildly different cases to respond to. So really, that's what we're suggesting, is use that enrollment and tuition sensitivity analysis to build a base, an upside, and a downside case. So I'm just porting over that same picture that I showed you a couple slides ago. At the top range, we have 392 would be our upside case of enrollment, and giving us about $9 million in gross tuition revenue. Our base case would be 365 enrollment, giving us about $8.2 million in gross tuition revenue. And then our downside case would be 338, giving us about $7.4 million in gross tuition revenue. So we're building our budget scenarios really based off of the gross tuition figures, and then adding what Alyssa was talking about as just a simple FA financial aid projection with some COVID increases. Really, the simplest case of this, hold everything else the same. Same fundraising across all three the base case, upside case, and downside case. Same summer camp, same everything else. Because really, those small percentages in this complicated time when you have a lot on your plate might not necessarily be worth it. But if you have that bandwidth, the step 2 would be adding complexity of creating upside downside base cases for fundraising using that sensitivity analysis. And then also doing what Alyssa was talking about of creating those archetypes and then increasing aid for specific archetypes. And then if you're just sitting around with tons of time in your hand and you want to do this, or if summer camp or after school or some alternative revenue source is a major part of your budget, go back to your historicals and say, what percentage of my students came to summer camp? And so then you're going to be able to create a historical percentage of if my enrollment has dropped 10%, then I'm going to drop 10% in my summer camp. And then also what was the revenue per student averages? And you can be able to alter your budget scenarios based on historicals. But really what we're saying, just vary your net tuition revenue across all of your budgets on the revenue sides, and you'll get some powerful budget scenarios. So then looking at your expense side, just like net tuition revenue was the main revenue driver of a school, really we only have one culprit that is our main expense driver for schools. We all know that is salaries and benefits. So I have translated again that graph to show what the 75th and 50th, the median and 25th percentile is based on the Cal-ISBOA survey. But if you want to go ahead and add into the chat, where do you fall into this? So what percentage of your total operating expenses does salaries and benefits represent? So let's see that range. Again, we got 73%. People know these right away. I'll let some numbers filter in. But if you're in that top 73, 75%, really this is that main factor that you should be looking at when you're building your budget scenarios. Just like really in the simplest case, the only thing that we were looking at on the revenue side was net tuition revenue. Yep. And so those percentages are very high. So we built our revenue side of our budget scenarios. If you're building your expense side, what I would suggest is just move for the FY19-20 spending. And I'll tell you why in a little bit. But if you want to add complexity, since benefits and salaries are that major driver, then only adjust that. So is there an opportunity to right size if your enrollment is falling at a certain point? So if you wanted to make your expense side of your budget scenario a little bit more complex, then really only adjust your your benefits and salary line. But to be completely honest, my recommendation is just port over the same expenses for your base case, your upside case, and your downside case. So you can really see that here is where we would be in terms of a surplus or deficit in each case. If you start varying each one of those cases off the bat, you're not really going to get that effect when you're looking at your cases side by side. So once you have built a case, it's time to actually use it. And so what I would suggest for everybody is to do a budget scenario planning exercise with either your finance committee or your full board. And budget scenario planning exercises are an incredible exercise that really makes sure that the decisions you're making as a CFO or as a finance officer are really aligning the budget to the mission, vision, and values of the school, as well as you're engaging the board in a strategic prioritization exercise that is proactive and not reactive. Alyssa, I don't know about you, but I spent basically the entire spring in a panic mode. Every single board meeting and emergency board meeting we had, I had no clue what was coming. And I felt like we were just, tossed around by all of these externalities, and we weren't really able to be intentional about how we were positioning ourselves or cutting or adding. And so what I would love for all of you to give as a gift to your board is to really have these conversations now and have a proactive plan to address either budget surpluses or deficits, as opposed to making your board and especially your finance committee panic every single time you call an emergency meeting. So we're going to be walking through a way that you can do this. All right, so the first one is to build your cases. We just walked through those systems of how do you build your cases. Simplest approach, just vary net tuition revenue and the upside, base, and downside cases. And then once you have built your 3 budget scenarios, then bring it to your finance committee or your full board. And what I'm suggesting you do is facilitate a group prioritization exercise that classifies your expense levers into what are the must-have things that we absolutely can't sacrifice without causing attrition in our school or total dissatisfaction and upheaval in our employees. What are the satisfiers? And then what are the delighters that we can add if we have enough surplus? And then what we would do is we would run through a scenario and then present externalities. So it would be giving you as a finance officer a path forward. You can proactively know if this trigger happens, if we fall below this level of enrollment, here's where I'm going to cut first, because that aligns to the mission, vision, and values of our school. So how do you build your cases? In what tool? So this is a little plug for a project that me and my partner, Ari Batoff, created for Cal-ISBOA last year. If you do not have your own financial tool to do visual modeling, we created a very simple tool that is available free for all Cal-ISBOA members. So Martha can put either the link on where you can download it in the chat, or she can send it out with the resources from this webinar. But what I would suggest is whatever tool you're using has a visualization component. I can't tell you how many times I've seen my fellow board members, especially ones without that financial bent to them, their eyes start glazing over when you present them spreadsheets or, God forbid, PDFs with frozen numbers. Please don't do that. It just drives me crazy. So the best that you can do is creating a dynamic worksheet that as you make changes, as you present externalities into the system, into the scenario, you can see dynamically in an interactive way how this would change either your operating surplus or deficit or even your net tuition revenue. So that's a little plug. But whatever tools that you have, build a visual component so that you can use it. So then once you have your base case, your upside case, and your downside case created, then what you should do is you should go to your finance committee or your full board and then present them with what are the levers that you have as a finance officer to change, right? You know your budget and you know where there's potentially things that can go if you needed to make room in your budget. So I've just added a couple here. Technology spending, retirement match. A lot of schools cut down on the retirement match. You know, increasing or decreasing the salary level, the salary increase or decrease year to year. Athletic programs is a place that I've heard a lot of schools thinking about cutting for next year. Decreasing instructional supplies, especially if we're in a virtual environment. Travel professional development is one way you can cut. Student support or staffing levels. So you know what those levers are in your budget on the expense side. So what I would say is create a list and bring that to your finance committee of here are the places that we can move around with, that we can pull if we need to. So then what we're going to do is you would lead a prioritization exercise on 3 different factors: mission alignment, alignment with community needs, and feasibility, affordability, technically. Okay. So here's a picture of a mission alignment exercise that I did with the school. It's all blanked out. But what you can do is very simple. If you're face to face, have all of those levers on a bunch of Post-it notes, and you just have a scale. Which one of these are very strongly mission aligned? Which ones are not? I can promise you, this is the best time. If you have those sacred cows that have been holding on that really aren't mission aligned, here's the time and here's the place that you can introduce the potential for cutting those out. So if something is not mission aligned in this environment, it should be on the table to cut. If you are in a virtual environment, I have facilitated an exercise like this using the program Padlet, which you can do little virtual stickies and you can move them up if it's strongly mission aligned and down to poorly mission aligned. Yep. Okay, never mind. Martha, did you have a question? Nope, good. So once you've eliminated all of those levers, or we've kind of targeted all of the levers that are very weakly mission aligned, those are the ones that should be your first cuts if you have to make cuts. But then we're keeping all of those elements. Probably most of your levers will be mission aligned. So then how do you create prioritization between things that are mission aligned? And this is the best system that I've ever found to create prioritization between different features or different programs that align to what your community wants or needs. So it's called a Kano model. You can look it up online, and it really distinguishes between different needs, I guess, the way your community responds to different programs. So if you look at that graph, I'm just going to be focusing on the blue line, on the orange line, and then on the pink line. So the blue lines are must-have programs or must-have attributes. So these are things that your families, your students, and your employees expect. And then also your mission and vision promises. If you don't have these, you're going to have people angry. You're going to have families leaving. You're going to have possibly employees leaving. The orange line is like the more the better programs or more the better attributes. So these are things that your family, students, employees want. If you don't have it, they're going to be disappointed, but they're not going to revolt. The more you have it, the better. And then that pink line, that pink curve are what we call delighters. These are things that people didn't even know that they wanted, but when they get, they're like, oh, this is fantastic. So I'll walk you through 2 examples. So one of our levers is most probably technology spending. And what's really interesting is that this lever has changed a lot over the last couple of months. So I would say if I was doing this exercise, what is the must-have level for technology spending? For me, is like, you better be funding reliable internet, and you better have a reliable and easy to use virtual platform, especially if you're going to virtual school. That is a must have. If you don't have that, your families will be angry and you will hear about it. So you can never decrease your spending below that level. But a satisfier would be adding digital curriculum supplements. So for example, an online Spanish program that supplements the face-to-face teachings of the teacher. So all of those things, if you don't have it, they're like, oh, but if you do have it, they're like, oh, this is great, wonderful, this makes me happy. And then a delighter is something they didn't even really know that they wanted, but if they get it, it's really cool. So like a virtual reality classroom. All right, let's do one more example so that you understand the concept, and then we'll move forward. So salary level. So if I was working through what is the must-have, satisfier, and delighter attributes of salary level with my finance committee, I would say we cannot ever fall below maintaining current salary level. If you start asking your faculty or your staff, especially in this moment where they are working so hard and so tirelessly, if you drop their salary level, you're going to have so much dissatisfaction and revolt that people might leave. So to me, that would be your must-have criteria for this expense lever. Whereas a satisfier, the more the better, would be increasing their salary. 1% is great, 2% is better, 3% is best. And then a delighter is, oh my gosh, we actually have more money in the system. We can give you a holiday bonus because we know that you've been working so well. Or even if we had done a salary freeze, we can backfill and actually give you that salary increase. So once you have worked out what are these must-have, satisfier, and delighter levels of your expenses with your finance committee or board, here's where your knowledge and expertise as a finance officer comes in, because these all cost money. And so that third level of a prioritization, the first one is this mission aligned? The second one, is this what our community wants and needs? And our third one is, can we afford this? What you would need to do is you would need to price out each one of those levers, those classifications of levers. And what I recommend in this, don't get in the weeds of giving an actual number. Give $1 sign, $2 signs, $3 signs, however much that is. If, based on your budget, if $1 sign is $0 to $50,000, that this is how much this would cost. $2 signs, 50 to 100,000, however much that works with your budget, just so that you can get kind of raw numbers to work with. So as your finance committee or your board is creating must-have, satisfier, and delighter levels, you are then assigning those dollar sign descriptors to them. So then, now that you've done all of that work, you can actually walk through a budget scenario. You take your base case, your upside case, and your downside case, and you analyze them. Where are there surpluses? Where are there deficits? And remember, we're really just talking about varying that net tuition revenue across all of our cases. So in the case of a surplus, what are the satisfier or delighter expenses that we can apply? So if we're running a surplus, where can we increase our salary levels from 1% to 3%? Or at what level can we actually, afford to do a holiday bonus? So really what you're asking your board to do is to then tell you, which one of these expense levers that we've just classified should I do first? Then should I do second? So you're asking them to create a pathway for you of when you're going through a surplus of what do you add first? What do you add next? What do you add next? On the opposite side of things, in your downside case, What are those levers that should fall back to the must-haves in order to balance the budget? Which ones are first? Which ones are second? Which ones are third? And so what you're doing is you're creating a proactive map that the board has not only approved, but the board has co-created and generated with you. So that when you are confronted with the actual scenario that happens next year, you know exactly where you should be cutting first, or you know exactly where you should be adding back if you have an unexpected windfall mid-year, for example. So that was the simple one. Bonus points if you want to add complexity to your scenarios, throwing in externalities, cancel summer camp and subtract all that revenue. Then what happens? Or if you want to add in some of that complexity from Alyssa's of increasing financial aid demand by having one of those archetypes severely affected, then how would your 3 base cases be affected? Or by decreasing enrollment. So then going into your data and knowing how many of these families have 2 parents working and more than 1 child in lower school, because if they're virtual again, they might be at risk for leaving. So the whole point of this scenario is really to help give you an iterative process as well as a participatory process that you can go through with your board to, 1, build better budget assumptions, to turn those into a 3 base upside and downside case scenario, and then to also walk through that prioritization exercise, and then to know where to go, know where to take your budget if and when you have to cut, or if and when you have an unexpected windfall. That was a lot, and I have 3 minutes. If you have questions now, know that both Alyssa and I, we are available. Here's our emails. If you have questions, you want to follow up with us, feel free, but we do have 3 minutes if you have questions on how to run this or how we constructed any of our assumptions. Kano model, seen it before, but where to read about it? I can definitely send
Send me a link and I'll put it on the
Sure.
website. How's that?
It was originally created, I think, in the 90s, and it's been used for product development of really trying to ascertain which features a product should have. And so what's interesting is your school is a product, right? And so we don't think about your school as a product. So applying product development features allows you to really take customer insight and allow you to choose where you're going, where and how you develop the product, which is your school.
So we'll post the slides, the recording, and some additional links, as well as the website information. Does anybody have any more questions? Because I do. First of all, thank you, because I do think that this talked about some very real things that we're dealing with and sort of how to have a contained and really focused conversation with our board and keeping it, in line with mission. So that's wonderful. But so my 2 questions are around a couple things that we've actually already talked about when we were talking about this, is kind of working with a board that is largely parent-based, which I know a lot of our schools have. So that's one element that I'm interested in, which I think this focus actually really helps. And then the other thing is very specific, because I know some of our schools are having the discussion of, are they going to have to lay employees off? And balancing out laying employees off versus salary discussions. On the one hand, schools say our faculty is working so hard, we can't not give them an increase. And then there's the possibility of having to lay people off and what that does. So those are kind of the 2 things I'd love you to talk about.
Sure. I'll jump in. Alyssa, if you have anything to add. To me, this is where prioritization exercise is so incredibly critical, because you need to have the board tell you what is more important, keeping everyone or paying everyone more, right? Because that is a trade-off. And so is the mission of your team or a mission of your school, does it privilege community and making sure that everybody, is staying together and that we're joining together, we're going to make it through together? Or is it remunerating hard work? So to me, if I was a finance officer, I would make my board, have that hard conversation and then give me that proactive map of here's at what point we would prioritize cutting faculty or staff, and here's at what point we would prioritize salary levels. And that is the purpose of a board, to make these hard decisions and to make sure that they are through the lens of the mission and values of the school. What was the first question? I was so caught up in the second one.
With a largely parent-based board and having these discussions when they get nervous.
Visuals is my biggest thing. Is if a picture tells 1,000 words, then a good graph or chart is better than a million spreadsheets. So if you are going in there with a table of data that has no context, and if you are not providing that data story, then you should only expect those people who come from a finance background to understand what you're going to say. So really think about how you're communicating to non-financial types, and really how are you backing up what you're saying with a graphic narrative as well, so that everybody has an entry point into the story that you're telling them. Listen, how do you do that with financial aid?
Well, I mean, I think with the board, I like talking to the board when they're trying to set tuition and getting real about, again, I love the archetypes because people can identify with that. But looking at when they say things like, well, it's just 5% increase in tuition, it's just 2%. Like, what is that? What is that? That's not a big deal. But then giving them the visual, like, well, do you know how much a family has to earn to afford the school, like just generally at the tuition rate it is today? And giving them, like Susie generic, this is how much a family needs to earn. And if we increase it, this is how much more they need to earn. And then on the financial aid side, just keeping it, like you said, I think it's the visual, a very specific, if we change this, this impacts this. And we completely remove, I personally don't want, in financial aid committees, I don't think it's helpful to have lots of board people on that. And if there ever is board people that are just sort of sort of lay people and on your board want to participate in that finance committee, then I think it's critically important to make that anonymous, that the information about the people are anonymous, because then you get lots of ridiculous additional information. Like, well, when they were on Facebook the other day, I saw, like the classic, but they drive a BMW situation. It adds too much, I don't want to say it humanizes, it adds too much, too many levers. And so I would do that. I would not really include, if you're going to have to include people on, then I would anonymize the data.
Yeah, well, and I think in some schools that happens regardless of whether they're a board member. So anonymizing the data is critical, because then it becomes anecdotal. Then we get away from the data, and it becomes anecdotal and personal. So
tagline. Yeah. If I had one tagline for my company, it would be just the facts, ma'am, because I can't do, I'm not going to be doing Google searches on whether they have an Airbnb in Costa Rica if I don't have the tax data to support any of that kind of stuff. And by removing yourself, I don't know who these families are. So I can be totally, completely, I have no bias for the family. So I think that's the only way to do that, is to make it anonymous. So then you remove the bias of really knowing who these particular families are. Yeah,
exactly. This was awesome, you guys. This was very helpful. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, you can see that the emails will be on the slides. We'll post this on the website. It was really, really helpful. We may have to do it again because everything's going to hopefully change. There's a lot of things that we just don't know. We don't know what's going to happen to the economy. We don't know what's going to happen with the vaccine. We just have to go with what we know now and be flexible as we can be, while providing for the stability of our organizations.
And all this is data because what we absolutely know was before COVID, California had the lowest birth rates in a century, right? And so if we don't start finding more children, and because we can't enroll kids that are not born, this data analysis is going to be useful way after COVID happens. So it's not going to be all for naught. That's a big thing. People are so worried they can do all this work for for this one specific situation. We are going to be dealing with reductions in enrollments and maybe right sizing our schools simply because of a population. I don't know if there's going to be a lot of Corona kids. I think there's probably more divorces than Corona kids happening, but that that there's an end game here, that it's not that you're just doing this for one particular thing. So we'll definitely
when you dive into your data and you look and you see perhaps how dependent you are on a particular industry or on a particular company, that may also direct you to broaden your funnel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Steve from Brentwood School was talking about the waterfall of this, then that, this, then that. So yeah, if you want to talk to him about how he ran this process too, I'm offering you up, Steve. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. And feel free to reach out.